I'm particularly interested in an essay called The Spirit Mercurius. So my thought here is that I will read actually the conclusion of the summary of The Spirit Mercurius. Actually, let me begin by reading the beginning of the summary, and then I'll read the end of the summary. And then beginning next week, I'll start to work through the entire essay, paragraph by paragraph. Dan says, resistance to the organized mass can be affected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself. Absolutely. No doubt about that. And part of this is about the issue that our friend Barbara raised the other day of raising up over the parapet. People don't often want to stand out. There's the old Japanese saying, the protruding nail gets hammered down. I guess we can look at American politics and see who the protruding nail is right now. I'll leave it to you to make a judgment about who the protruding nail is. Maybe there's more than one. I might be one of them, of course. But ultimately, the mass will return to being a mass. The summary of The Spirit Mercurius, and this is in paragraph 284, page 237 of volume 13 of the Collected Works. The multiple aspects of Mercurius may be summarized as follows. 1. Mercurius consists of all conceivable opposites. He is thus quite obviously a duality, but is named a unity in spite of the fact that his innumerable inner contradictions can dramatically fly apart into an equal number of disparate and apparently independent figures. 2. He is both material and spiritual. 3. He is the process by which the lower and material is transformed into the higher and spiritual, and vice versa. 4. He is the devil, a redeeming psychopomp, an evasive trickster, and God's reflection in physical nature. 5. He is also the reflection of a mystical experience of the artifacts that coincides with the opus alchemicum. 6. As such, he represents on the one hand the self, and on the other the individuation process, and, because of the limitless number of his names, also the collective unconscious. Now, I just mentioned that Mercurius, or Mercury, there used to be a statue of Mercury on the top of a building in downtown Rochester, New York. It was put away for many years, about 40 years, in storage. And finally, when I lived in Rochester in the early 1980s, late 1970s, they cleaned it up and put it back on the top of a building in downtown Rochester. Let me just mention that the term adumbration means a vague foreshadowing. So now I will read from later in this summary. I'm reading starting with paragraph 300. Mercurius is an adumbration, that is a vague foreshadowing, of the primordial light-bringer who is never himself the light, but who brings the light of nature, the light of the moon and the stars, which fades before the new morning light. Of this light, St. Augustine says that it will never turn to darkness unless the Creator is abandoned by the love of his creatures. But this too belongs to the rhythm of day and night. As Holderlin says in Patmos, Patmos is the name of a Holderlin poem. And shamefully, a power wrests away the heart from us. For the heavenly each demands sacrifice, but if it should be withheld, never has that led to good. Paragraph 301. When all visible lights are extinguished, one finds, according to the words of the wise Vajnavalkya, the light of the self. What then is the light of man? Self is his light. It is by the light of the self that a man rests, goes forth, does his work, and returns. This is from one of the Upanishads. It's mentioned by Hume in the 13 principal Upanishads. The idea of self is obviously quite old because the Upanishads date back more than 2,000 years. Going back, I'll reread that last sentence. It is by the light of the self that a man rests, goes forth, does his work, and returns. Thus, with Augustine, the first day of creation begins with self-knowledge, cognitio sui ipsius, by which is meant a knowledge not of the ego, but of the self, that objective phenomenon of which the ego is the subject. Then, following the order of the days of creation in Genesis, comes knowledge of the firmament, of the earth, the sea, the plants, the stars, the animals of the water and air, and finally, on the sixth day, knowledge of land animals and of ipsius hominis, of man himself. The cognitio matutina is self-knowledge, but the cognitio vespertina is knowledge of man. Cognitio matutina, I believe, is knowledge of the morning or of youth, and cognitio vespertina is the knowledge of the evening or old age. As Augustine describes it, the cognitio matutina gradually grows old as it loses itself in the 10,000 things and finally comes to man, although one would expect this to have happened already with the onset of self-knowledge. But if this were true, Augustine's parable would have lost its meaning by contradicting itself. Such an obvious lapse cannot be ascribed to so gifted a man. His real meaning is that self-knowledge is the scientia creatoris, a morning light revealed after a night during which consciousness slumbered, wrapped in the darkness of the unconscious. But the knowledge arising from this first light finally and inevitably becomes the scientio hominis, the knowledge of man, who asks himself, who is it that knows and understands everything? Why it is myself, that marks the coming of darkness, out of which arises the seventh day, the day of rest. But the rest of God signifies the rest of those who rest in God. The Sabbath is therefore the day on which man returns to God and receives anew the light of the cognitio matutina, and this day has no evening. From the symbological standpoint, it may be without significance that Augustine had in mind the pagan names of the days of the week. The growing darkness reaches its greatest intensity on the day of Venus, Friday, and changes into Lucifer on Saturday. On Saturn's day, Saturday heralds the light, which appears in full strength on Sunday. As I have shown, Mercurius is closely related not only to Venus, but more especially to Saturn. So as Mercurius is Juvenus, as Saturn, Senex. Senex means old man. Okay, moving on. Paragraph 302, it seemed to me that Augustine apprehended a great truth, namely that every spiritual truth gradually turns into something material, becoming no more than a tool in the hand of man. In consequence, man can hardly avoid seeing himself as a knower, yes, even as a creator, with boundless possibilities at his command. The alchemist was basically this sort of person, but much less so than modern man. An alchemist could still pray, quote, purge the horrible darknesses in our mind, unquote. But modern man is already so darkened that nothing beyond the light of his own intellect illuminates his world. Occasius Christi, Passio Christi. Sorry, I don't have the translation of that. That surely is why such strange things are happening to our much lauded civilization, more like a Gadamerung than any normal twilight. I just point out that this essay was written and presented in 1942 at the Erasmus Conference in Italy, rewritten and represented in 1948, and then published in English by the Psychology Club of New York in 1953. And here's the last paragraph, paragraph 303. Mercurius, that two-faced God, comes as the lumen naturae, the servitor and salvator, only to those whose reason strives toward the highest light ever received by man, and who do not trust exclusively in the cognitio vespertina. For those who are unmindful of this light, the lumen naturae turns into a perilous ignis fatuus, and the psychopomp into a diabolical seducer. Lucifer, who could have brought light, becomes the father of lies, whose voice in our time, supported by press and radio, revels in orgies of propaganda and leads untold millions to ruin. I'm just translating the Latin for you. Lumen naturae is the light of nature. Cognitio vespertina is the awareness of evening. And ignis fatuus is a wisp. So I'll just read that again after giving you those translations. Mercurius, that two-faced God, comes to the lumen naturae, the servitor and salvator, only to those whose reason strives toward the highest light ever received by man, and who do not trust exclusively to the cognitio vespertina. For those who are unmindful of this light, the lumen naturae turns into a perilous ignis fatuus, and the psychopomp into a diabolical seducer. Lucifer, who could have brought light, becomes the father of lies, whose voice in our time, supported by press and radio, revels in orgies of propaganda and leads untold millions to ruin. So I just point back to the definition of adumbration, which is vague foreshadowing, and I won't make further comment on what Dr. Jung was referring to, except to comment that he first gave this paper in 1942. And if you are not a member of our Dropbox, I urge you to send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will make you a member of the Dropbox. Also, we run an advanced reading group on Tuesdays at 1:30 Eastern U.S. time, and I would welcome you to join that. In that conference, we are talking about Aion, which is one of Dr. Jung's rock'em sock'em books about Christianity, and also about the unconscious. We're currently about halfway through chapter 4, which is the chapter on the self, and the next chapter that we'll be discussing is chapter 5, which is Christ as a symbol of the self. And if you have not joined us originally, you can see all the earlier sessions in video form on our advanced reading group Dropbox, which is a separate Dropbox from the general Dropbox. Thomas says, appropriately, we are astrologically speaking about to enter a Mercury retrograde period in a couple of days. Oh God, what could possibly go wrong? every time I turn on my iPhone or the news, I go, oh my God, what are we doing here? Gray says, Aion is horrifying, but chapter 5 is beautiful. Okay, well, I thought it was horrifying as well because I have to say I read it originally about 10 years ago, and I just read through it, and I just could not grok what Dr. Jung was saying about Christ as a symbol of the self. I said, what is he talking about? This is the Son of God. I mean, I was brought up as a Christian, so we're talking about the Son of God, and Dr. Jung is talking about Christ as a symbol of the self. Well, finally, after much study and after trying to operate this reading group for the last 2 years, I've finally grokked what he was talking about. But I do acknowledge that it is horrifying because it really points out to us some of the issues that are in Christianity. Now, I believe that Christianity will revivify itself by understanding what it was that Dr. Jung was talking about, because the archetypal aspects of the stories are still relevant. They're meaningful to us at a very deep level, at an unconscious level. When I go to church, I am sort of revivified by going to church, and how I'm revivified is a mystery, and it always has happened with me. And so I know that there is something there, but I understand now that it's coming through myself and through the unconscious. And I think the fundamental problem that we all have had is that Christianity for 2,000 years has been pointing up there for God, and Galileo found out how hard it is to say, oh, by the way, there's no God up there, and or yes, there is God up there, but it's not what you think. The point I made last week is that Dr. Jung responded to Nietzsche's comment, God is dead, by establishing that God lives, where God lives, and how God goes about doing the business of the Godhead. That is a topic that we will discuss going forward, such as my homily for today. Yes, the Word has to become flesh. That's absolutely true. And by flesh, it means in the experience of a living human being. The Bible is all well and good and the most popular book ever written, but until it becomes flesh through you and through me, it has no meaning. It's nothing but words. As Joseph Fiennes says in Shakespeare in Love, words. He was very frustrated in that movie when he was trying to write one time, and that sort of sums up the frustration that I have now with the Logos and how it's being pushed upon us. I want to make one comment going back to the early part of the chat here, which is yesterday Grenade had asked me, is personality dissociation synonymous to cognitive dissonance, or are you talking about pathological dissociation, identity disorder? What's the difference? Okay, well, that is beyond my pay grade. Okay, I'm not a mental health professional, and I'm not a trained psychologist, and so those are really questions for people that are in those professions. My purpose here is only to bring forward the work of C.G. Jung and try to explain what I, as a layman, think he was talking about. I'm not saying I'm right. You can certainly disagree with me. I'm only saying that this is the way I interpret it and how I make it useful in my own life. So, Lady Fairfax, yes, we are now live streaming every Monday evening at 8 p.m. And also for the advanced reading group, we're live streaming on Zoom every Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And for the advanced reading group, those videos are not available to the public. Those videos are in our Dropbox for the advanced reading group, so you can catch up if you've missed any. We started to talk about Aion about 8 weeks ago, so there's 8 weeks worth of video there in that Dropbox, and tomorrow we'll be at it again at 1:30. And so 100% says Carl Jung touches my heart, and as it should be, because that's where he's aiming his work. He's aiming his work at experience and at eros, not at logos, which is dry and empty until you bring it into your own life.